As my mother sneered and told my sister's wealthy new fiancé that I was just the pathetic, unemployed loser of the family, she had no idea that the luxury restaurant we were sitting in belonged entirely to me. My sister laughed and told me to lie about my life so I wouldn't embarrass them, completely blind to the fact that her fiancé's company was about to be shut down by my secret investment firm in less than 10 minutes. I just smiled, took a sip of my water, and watched the exact second my sister's fiancé looked at his phone screen, turned completely white, and realized he had just insulted the powerful billionaire boss he had been begging to meet for the last 6 months. When they finally realized that their golden child's sudden lifestyle collapse was caused by the quiet sister they had just discarded, a brutal domestic meltdown began. But I was already gone, watching their fake world burn from the comfort of my own success. Growing up, I was always the invisible child in our house. My name is Maya Sterling. For as long as I can remember, my younger sister Serafina was the undisputed star of the family. She was beautiful, loud, and loved being the center of attention. My mother, Beatrice, treated Serafina like a precious princess who could do no wrong. If Serafina wanted a new designer dress, my mother would buy it instantly, even if it meant we couldn't afford vital household bills or electricity. If Serafina got a low grade at school, my mother would run to the principal's office, shouting and blaming the teacher. But with me, things were completely different. I was the quiet one, who loved books, coding, and learning how global businesses worked. Because I didn't care about makeup, expensive fashion, or popular internet trends, my mother viewed me as a complete disappointment, constantly knocking on my door just to tell me I was wasting my time and would never amount to anything in life. The moment I turned 18, I packed my bags and moved out of that suffocating environment. I didn't ask my parents for a single dollar because I knew their help always came with toxic strings attached. I worked 2 exhausting part-time jobs while going to college full-time, living in a tiny, freezing apartment and eating cheap instant noodles just to survive the week. During those long, sleepless nights, I poured every ounce of my remaining energy into building a digital automation platform that helped corporate firms manage their complex finances. After 3 years of endless coding and brutal market testing, my software finally took off. A major global technology conglomerate bought my platform for a massive multi-million-dollar payout, changing my financial reality forever. Instead of spending that money on luxury sports cars or giant mansions just to show off to the world, I stayed smart, grounded, and intensely focused on long-term wealth. I created a private equity firm called Meridian Capital. I hired a team of brilliant financial experts to run the daily corporate operations, while I remained the silent sole owner and chief decision maker. Over the next 5 years, my company grew rapidly into a massive financial empire, acquiring office skyscrapers and high-end restaurant chains across the country. By the time I was 27, I had built immense wealth, but I kept it a complete secret from my family. I knew their character all too well. They only cared about money and shallow social status. If they found out I was wealthy, they would immediately fake their affection and try to drain my bank account to fund their lavish habits. So I happily played the quiet, low-achieving role they had already written for me. Whenever I visited them, I wore simple clothes, drove a modest used sedan, and told them I did basic, work-from-home, freelance computer work. Because of this, my mother instantly decided that freelancing was just a fancy word for being completely unemployed and lazy. She proudly told all her friends and neighbors that I was a struggling loser who couldn't secure a real job in the city. Serafina absolutely loved this dynamic because it meant she was always the superior, successful daughter. For years, every single family holiday and casual gathering was filled with sharp, passive-aggressive comments about my lack of a career, my cheap clothes, and my bleak future. I quietly endured all of it, letting their petty insults bounce right off me, because I knew the real truth about my net worth. The real trouble started a few weeks ago when Serafina met a man named Julian. According to my mother's ecstatic, nonstop phone calls, Julian was a brilliant young entrepreneur who owned a fast-growing tech company downtown, drove a luxury sports car, and lived in a fancy penthouse overlooking the river. My mother was completely over the moon, constantly bragging that Serafina had secured the perfect wealthy husband who would finally lift the entire family into high society circles. I didn't care about their shallow bragging, but out of pure professional curiosity, I decided to look up Julian's company on my secure corporate network. His business was a digital delivery network called NovaLogix. It took me less than 5 minutes of reviewing their public filings and internal credit reports to see the ugly truth behind Julian's fancy lifestyle. His company was actually in deep financial trouble due to his reckless personal spending on luxury offices, high-end marketing, and personal yachts. He was drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt and was on the very verge of total bankruptcy. The absolute only thing keeping his company alive was a desperate application he had submitted to my investment firm, Meridian Capital, begging for a $5 million emergency loan. He had a vital, final meeting scheduled with my managing director, Arthur, for the following Monday morning. Julian had absolutely no idea that the anonymous principal owner, who held his entire future and career in her hands, was the quiet, despised sister of his new girlfriend. To celebrate their upcoming engagement, my mother organized a grand family dinner at an incredibly exclusive 5-star restaurant downtown called the Gilded Orchid. What they didn't know was that Meridian Capital had bought the Gilded Orchid restaurant group exactly 1 year ago. The moment I walked through the doors, the restaurant manager subtly bowed his head in deep respect, recognizing me instantly. To the staff, I was the ultimate boss who signed their monthly paychecks. But to my family, I was just an embarrassment. When I arrived at the private dining room wearing a simple sweater and dark pants, my mother and sister looked at me with immediate, burning disgust. Serafina whispered loudly, rolling her eyes, asking if I really could not find anything better to wear to a high-class place like this, telling me I looked like a disgrace. My mother sharply warned me to keep my mouth shut during the evening so I wouldn't embarrass them in front of Julian. When Julian arrived, wearing an expensive tailored suit and a flashy watch, my family spent the night worshiping his every word while completely ignoring my presence. The breaking point arrived when the main courses were served. Julian turned his attention toward me, politely asking what I did for work and if I had a real career in the city. Before I could even open my mouth to give a polite response, my mother sharply cut me off, glaring across the table and shouting loudly, "Don't embarrass us." Everyone at the family dinner laughed out loud at my mother's harsh words. Serafina giggled, leaned closer to her fiancé, and added with a mean smirk, "Maybe lie this time so you don't sound so pathetic." They all kept staring at me, waiting to see if I would cry. Julian smiled, shaking his head with a superior look, remarking that the job market can be tough for people without specific skills. They fully expected me to look down at my plate in deep shame, but I just smiled. Underneath the dinner table, I quietly pulled out my phone, logged into my private company network, and sent a direct, unyielding message to my managing director. Look at the NovaLogix file for Monday. The owner lacks basic integrity and character. Cancel the meeting, reject the loan immediately, and permanently blacklist the company across our entire investment network. Exactly 4 minutes later, Julian's phone began to vibrate loudly on the white tablecloth. He excused himself, boasting that it was an official email notification from Meridian Capital regarding his massive expansion plan. But as his eyes moved across the screen, the arrogant smile instantly vanished. The color completely drained from his face, his skin turned a sickly pale white, and his hands began to tremble so violently that he almost dropped his phone into his plate. The email was a brutal, final rejection. It explicitly stated that his company was being blacklisted from any future funding due to a total lack of corporate integrity. Without this $5 million, his business would face forced, immediate bankruptcy within a month. Julian whispered in pure terror that his company was completely done and he was ruined. Serafina panicked, grabbing his arm and desperately asking what was wrong, suggesting he just go to another rich company. Julian lost his temper completely and slammed his hand onto the table, making the fine china plates rattle. He screamed at her, calling her a complete idiot and explaining that Meridian Capital was the single biggest investment firm in the state, and that if they blacklisted his name, no bank or investor in the entire country would ever touch his business again. He yelled that someone inside that company had deliberately and ruthlessly destroyed him tonight. My mother, breathing heavily in absolute horror, begged Julian to calm down, asking if he could just call the boss. Julian desperately scrolled to the bottom of the email, muttering that the rejection was ordered directly by the mysterious principal owner, M. Sterling. He cried out that he had been begging for a 5-minute phone call for months, and now she had crushed his entire life with a single click. At that exact moment, my phone screen lit up right in the middle of the table. The bright screen caught Julian's eye. He looked down and saw the internal corporate logo of Meridian Capital flashing on my lock screen, followed by a text message from my managing director confirming the permanent blacklist. Julian froze instantly. He stared at my phone, then slowly raised his head to look at me, his eyes wide with a level of absolute terror that I had never seen in a human being before. The puzzle pieces instantly came together in his mind. He whispered my name, asking if I was actually M. Sterling. Serafina let out a sharp, annoyed laugh, calling him crazy and telling him I was just her pathetic sister Maya, who didn't even have a real job. Julian stood up, turning red with pure fury, and screamed at Serafina to shut her mouth. He shouted that her sister wasn't unemployed at all, but actually owned the multi-million-dollar financial empire that held his entire life in her hands. The entire private dining room went completely dead silent until their faces went pale. My mother's mouth fell open and Serafina's face went entirely white with shock. I looked at them and told them completely smoothly and calmly that I always said I worked on my laptop, but they were the ones who arrogantly decided that meant I was pathetic and unemployed. I told them they never cared enough to ask what I actually did because they were too busy using my quiet nature to make themselves feel important. Julian didn't care about our family drama. He walked around the table and literally dropped to his knees right next to my chair, weeping openly and begging me for mercy, claiming he was just trying to agree with my mother and sister to be a good guest. I looked down at him coldly, telling him that in the business world, I only invest in people who have character and integrity, which he completely lacked. I told him his application was permanently denied. Julian stood up, his despair turning into wild rage. He turned on Serafina and my mother with absolute hatred in his eyes, screaming that their arrogant pride and toxic behavior had completely ruined his business and his entire life. He broke off the engagement on the spot, pushed his chair over, and stormed out of the private room, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy. Serafina began to sob uncontrollably, burying her face in her hands, while my mother looked at me with eyes full of intense fear and deep regret. She reached her hand out across the table, begging me to save Julian's company for the sake of the family and my sister's happiness. I stood up slowly, feeling absolutely no sadness, no anger, and no guilt. The heavy chains of family expectation were gone forever. I told them quietly that I was completely done playing the role of the submissive daughter who takes their emotional abuse just to keep the peace. I picked up my purse, and before walking out, I added with a calm smile that since I owned this entire restaurant group, I had already instructed the manager to charge the full, undiscounted price of this expensive dinner to my mother's credit card. I walked out of the restaurant and stepped into the cool night air, feeling completely free. Over the next few weeks, my mother and sister tried to call me hundreds of times, leaving desperate, crying voicemails begging for forgiveness and money. I permanently blocked their numbers and cut off every single tie to that toxic dynamic. A month later, Julian's company officially went bankrupt and all his luxury assets were seized by creditors. Serafina was left with absolute public embarrassment among her high society friends, and my mother was forced to deal with massive credit card debts, forcing them to move out of their expensive neighborhood and live on a very tight budget. They finally had to face the harsh reality of their own empty vanity. Meanwhile, I continued to successfully grow my financial empire, surrounding myself with real friends and honest people who loved me for who I was, living my life in absolute peace and quiet success. Building a truly successful and happy life requires you to understand a very simple, raw truth. Some people, even those who share your own blood, will always try to push you down into the dark, just to make their own small light look brighter. Do not ever let your family use your kindness, your patience, or your quiet nature as a doormat for their own arrogance and entitlement. The bond of family does not give anyone a free license to abuse you, disrespect your hard work, or treat your life as if it is completely unimportant. When people try to humiliate you or treat you like a failure just to satisfy their own superficial pride, do not waste your precious time and energy screaming, crying, or fighting back with loud words. The absolute best counterattack is to stay completely calm, quietly secure your personal boundaries, and build your fortress of success in silence. Let your achievements be the ultimate answer to their cruelty. And when the time comes, simply walk away and let the cold, unyielding reality of the world teach them the true, devastating cost of their actions. Protect your mental peace, secure your financial future, and never look back.